The evening briefing on March 8, 1945, began like dozens before it. Hundreds of B-29 crewmen filed into the massive Quonset hut on Guam, their boots scuffing against the coral dust floor, their faces already showing the familiar mixture of boredom and dread that preceded another high-altitude mission over Japan. They had been flying these raids for months now, watching their bombs scatter uselessly in 200-mile-per-hour winds, watching sister ships plunge into the Pacific with empty fuel tanks, watching the war effort sputter despite flying the most advanced bomber in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Sam Bakshas settled into his seat among the 300 other pilots, navigators, and bombardiers crowding the briefing room. At 34 years old, the Montana native stood taller and broader than most of the younger men around him, his 6'1" frame a reassuring presence to his crew. He had flown enough missions to know the pattern. The intelligence officer would pull back the curtain to reveal the target map, Tokyo again, probably. They would groan. Someone would calculate the fuel requirements for a round trip at 30,000 feet. Someone else would worry aloud about the jet stream winds that had been clocking at over 250 miles per hour at bombing altitude, winds that could blow their bombs into the sea before they fell halfway to Earth. But when the curtain drew back that evening, the murmur in the room changed pitch. The flight altitude numbers looked wrong. Instead of the usual 30,000 feet, the chart showed 5,000 to 7,800 feet. For a moment, the room fell silent as hundreds of men processed what they were seeing. Then the questions erupted. Someone had made a mistake. The numbers were reversed. This had to be a typo. The briefing officer raised his hand for silence. No mistake, he confirmed. General Curtis LeMay had ordered a complete tactical reversal of every bombing doctrine they had been taught. They would fly low. They would fly at night. They would strip their aircraft of most defensive armament to carry maximum incendiary bomb loads. They would attack individually rather than in protective formations. And they would do all of this tomorrow night against the most heavily defended target in the Japanese Empire. The room erupted. Men shouted over each other, voices rising with panic and anger. LeMay had lost his mind. This was suicide. Every principle of strategic bombing since 1917 said you bombed from high altitude where enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire could not reach you. You flew in tight defensive formations where your combined firepower could protect against interceptors. You kept your gunners at their stations because a bomber without guns was a sitting duck. You never, ever, deliberately flew into the teeth of enemy defenses at altitudes where every gun could reach you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Later, one crewman would describe the mood perfectly when he wrote that most men left that briefing convinced of two things. First, that Curtis LeMay was indeed a maniac. Second, that many of them would not live to see the next day. Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay sat in his headquarters reviewing the final mission orders, aware that his career, his reputation, and potentially hundreds of American lives now rested on calculations that contradicted every established principle of aerial warfare. The 38-year-old commander had deliberately not informed his superior, General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the United States Army Air Forces, about this radical tactical change. LeMay understood the logic perfectly. If the mission succeeded, Arnold would praise his initiative. If it failed catastrophically, Arnold could fire him and claim ignorance of the plan. The decision to gamble everything on tactics that his own crews considered suicidal had not come lightly. LeMay had spent months analyzing why the B-29 Superfortress, the most expensive weapons program of the war, costing more than the Manhattan Project, was failing to achieve results against Japan. The problems were devastating and undeniable. When LeMay had taken command of the 20th Bomber Command operating from China in August 1944, his bombers were hitting their targets only 5% of the time. 5%. The remaining 95% of bombs either missed entirely or were blown so far off course by upper atmosphere winds that they posed more danger to Japanese fish than Japanese factories. The jet stream had proven to be an enemy as formidable as any Japanese fighter. Meteorologists were only beginning to understand this river of air flowing at altitudes between 20,000 and 35,000 feet, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour. At that speed, a bomb dropped from a B-29 at 30,000 feet would be carried miles horizontally before reaching the ground. Bombardiers tried to compensate by calculating wind drift angles, but the jet stream shifted and varied unpredictably. What worked on one mission failed on the next. The mechanical toll was equally catastrophic. The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone engines that powered the B-29 were marvels of engineering, producing 2,200 horsepower each through turbocharging and supercharging systems that maintained power at high altitude. But those same complex systems made the engines temperamental and prone to overheating. Crews joked darkly that the most dangerous part of a B-29 mission was the 14-hour round trip from the Marianas to Japan, during which at least one engine per aircraft would typically fail or catch fire. High-altitude bombing at 30,000 feet pushed those engines to their operational limits. The superchargers ran constantly at maximum boost to maintain power in thin air. The turbochargers glowed red-hot. Engine fires became so common that crews developed emergency procedures and simply accepted that they would likely lose at least one engine per mission. The fuel consumption at high altitude, fighting headwinds that could exceed 100 miles per hour, meant that B-29s often arrived back at their island bases with fuel tanks nearly empty. Some did not arrive at all, ditching in the Pacific when their fuel ran out 50 or 100 miles from home. The operational losses were unsustainable, not from enemy action, but from mechanical failures and fuel exhaustion. LeMay's analysts calculated that they were losing more aircraft to engine problems and fuel starvation than to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire combined. The strategic bombing campaign, the mission for which the B-29 had been specifically designed, was failing. American industry had poured billions of dollars into developing a bomber that could reach Japan from Pacific Island bases and destroy its war-making capacity through precision high-altitude bombardment. After 6 months of operations, that strategy had achieved almost nothing. The pressure on LeMay was immense. General Arnold had staked his reputation on the B-29 program, fighting political battles and risking his career to secure funding and priority for Superfortress production. Arnold expected results. The American public expected results, the war effort demanded results, and Curtis LeMay's current tactics were producing nothing but wasted bombs, lost aircraft, and frustrated crews. LeMay understood that incremental adjustments would not solve the fundamental problems. The jet stream could not be avoided. The engines could not be made significantly more reliable in the time available. Japanese air defenses were improving, not weakening. What was needed was not refinement of existing tactics, but complete tactical revolution. The inspiration had come partially from British Royal Air Force Bomber Command, which had pioneered area bombing attacks on German cities using incendiary weapons. The RAF had learned through bitter experience that precision bombing of specific industrial targets was nearly impossible under combat conditions. Instead, they developed tactics for creating firestorms in urban areas, destroying not just individual factories but entire industrial districts along with the workers who staffed them and the infrastructure that supported production. LeMay had studied these methods. He had analyzed intelligence reports on Japanese urban construction, learning that Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other major cities were largely built of wood and paper. Structures that had stood for generations were essentially kindling, waiting for a spark. American intelligence services had even produced detailed maps ranking districts by their combustibility. Tokyo's Shitamachi district, the working-class neighborhoods where small factories were interspersed among residential areas, rated as the most flammable urban area in the world. The tactical logic began to crystallize in LeMay's mind. If Japanese cities were vulnerable to fire, and if precision bombing from high altitude was impossible due to winds and weather, then the solution was area bombing with incendiaries from low altitude. but low-altitude bombing raised immediate objections. Every bomber doctrine since World War I emphasized altitude as protection. High altitude kept bombers above most anti-aircraft fire and made interception by fighters more difficult. Flying low seemed to violate the first principle of bomber survival. LeMay challenged those assumptions with cold analysis. Japanese air defenses in early 1945 were not what American planners feared. Japanese fighter forces had been decimated by years of attrition. Pilot training programs had been shortened repeatedly as experienced instructors died in combat. The replacement pilots now defending Japan had perhaps 50 hours of flight time compared to the hundreds of hours American pilots received. More critically, Japanese fighters lacked effective night fighting capability. They had no airborne radar, no coordinated ground control systems, and inadequate training for night interception. Japanese anti-aircraft guns were calibrated for high-altitude targets. Their crews had trained to engage bombers at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, where the B-29s usually operated. At 5,000 feet, those guns would need to be re-aimed and recalibrated, a process that took time and created confusion during the chaos of an attack. The weight calculations were equally compelling. A B-29, configured for high-altitude precision bombing, carried extensive defensive armament. 12 50-caliber Browning machine guns in 4 remote-controlled turrets, plus a tail position with additional guns or a 20mm cannon. Each gun required hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The gunners themselves, 5 or 6 men per aircraft, added substantial weight along with their oxygen equipment and protective gear. That defensive armament and crew mass represented several tons that could instead be bombs. If LeMay stripped most of the guns and left the gunners behind, each B-29 could carry perhaps 7 tons of incendiaries instead of the usual 4 tons of mixed ordnance. The bombing capacity of his entire force would nearly double, but stripping guns from bombers seemed to violate fundamental survival principles. Bombers needed defensive firepower to ward off attacking fighters. Crews relied on their gunners, not just for protection, but for psychological security. The relationship between pilot, bombardier, navigator, engineer, and gunners created tight bonds. Many crew members considered their gunners family. The idea of flying combat missions without these men seemed to abandon comrades and invite catastrophe. LeMay faced intense opposition from his own staff when he proposed these changes. His wing commanders argued strenuously against stripping guns. Operations officers insisted that low-altitude night attacks would result in catastrophic casualties. Intelligence officers warned that Japanese defenses, while weakened, still possessed enough strength to shoot down dozens of vulnerable bombers attacking at medium altitude. The debate became heated. Some staff officers accused LeMay of gambling with American lives on unproven theories. Others suggested the stress of command had affected his judgment. A few threatened to request transfer rather than participate in what they considered a suicide mission. LeMay listened to all objections, then overruled them. He had made his decision based on analysis, not emotion. The current tactics were failing. Continuing to fail safely was still failure. The only path to success required accepting risks that seemed unacceptable under conventional doctrine. The mission-designated Operation Meeting House would test LeMay's theories on the largest scale yet attempted. Over 300 B-29 superfortresses would launch from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian in the Mariana Islands on the evening of March 9, 1945. They would fly 7 hours across 1,500 miles of Pacific Ocean. They would arrive over Tokyo after midnight and attack individually from altitudes between 5,000 and 7,800 feet. They would carry only incendiary bombs, specifically the M69 incendiary bomblet, a 6-pound canister filled with jellied gasoline that would ignite on impact and burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The target area was a 3-by-4-mile rectangle in northeastern Tokyo, a densely populated district estimated to house 750,000 people in wood and paper structures built so closely together that fire could leap from building to building faster than people could run. LeMay knew exactly what he was ordering. This would not be precision bombing of military targets. This would be the deliberate creation of a firestorm designed to consume an entire district of Japan's capital city. The military justification rested on intelligence assessments that small factories throughout the target area produced components for Japanese war industries. By destroying the workshops, the workers, and the infrastructure, the attack would cripple production more effectively than precision strikes against individual large factories. But LeMay also understood the moral dimension. This attack would kill tens of thousands of civilians, perhaps more. The target area contained homes, schools, shops, temples, women, children, elderly. People who worked in factories because their government required it, who had no choice in Japan's decision to wage war. The doctrine of total war, developed over years of conflict in Europe and the Pacific, held that civilian morale and industrial capacity were legitimate military targets. If destroying civilian areas would shorten the war and save Allied lives that would otherwise be lost in an invasion of Japan, then the bombing could be justified as the lesser evil. These justifications did not erase the human reality. LeMay would later acknowledge that had the Allies lost the war, he would likely have been prosecuted as a war criminal for ordering attacks that deliberately targeted civilian populations. The moral weight of that knowledge rested heavily on the 38-year-old general as he reviewed the final mission orders. On the islands of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, maintenance crews worked through the night of March 8th and into March 9th, preparing B-29s for the mission. The workload was extraordinary. Many aircraft had defensive guns and ammunition removed, though the historical record remains unclear about exactly how many bombers were fully stripped versus having only ammunition quantities reduced. The work required removing turrets or at minimum extracting guns and ammunition, patching fuselage panels, and redistributing weight to maintain proper aircraft balance. Bomb bays were loaded with cluster bombs, each containing 38 M69 incendiary bomblets. The clusters would break apart at altitude, spreading the bomblets across a wide area. Upon impact, a white phosphorus charge would ignite the jellied gasoline, creating an adhesive flame that could not be extinguished with water. The sheer quantity of incendiaries being loaded was staggering. 1,665 tons of firebombs would be carried by the attacking force, 500,000 individual bomblets. Enough fire to consume everything combustible across 16 square miles if conditions were right. Maintenance crews worked with grim determination, understanding that they were preparing their friends for a mission from which many might not return. In the crew briefing rooms, the mood had shifted from shock to resignation. The men understood they had no choice. Orders had been given. The mission would proceed. Some crews gathered in small groups, talking quietly, making dark jokes to mask their fear. Others wrote letters home, just in case. A few sought out chaplains for prayer or confession. All of them understood that by this time tomorrow they would either be celebrating an unlikely victory or mourning dead friends. The first B-29 lifted off from North Field on Guam at 35 minutes past 5 in the evening, Chamorro Standard Time, March 9th, 1945. It was followed by another at 50-second intervals, then another. The takeoff sequence continued for over an hour as bomber after bomber climbed into the tropical evening sky, circled to gain altitude, then set course northwest toward Japan. From Saipan and Tinian, more B-29s joined the stream. Over 325 aircraft launched, the largest bomber force yet assembled in the PacificTheater, all bound for Tokyo, all committed to tactics their crews considered potentially suicidal. Brigadier General Thomas Sarsfield Power commanded the attacking force. LeMay had selected Power to lead because he considered him the best wing commander available, aggressive and tactically skilled. Power flew at the head of the formation from Guam, sharing the risks with his men. The weather was forecast to be clear over Tokyo with high surface winds, conditions that would aid the spread of fires once started. As darkness fell across the Pacific, hundreds of B-29s droned northwest through the night sky. Their bomb bays were heavy with incendiary clusters, their fuel tanks were full, their crews were tense, and Curtis LeMay sat in his Guam headquarters, waiting to learn whether his revolutionary gamble would succeed or become the greatest disaster in American strategic bombing history. The 7-hour flight across the Pacific gave B-29 crews ample time to contemplate their fate. In the pressurized cabins, men sat at their stations watching endless ocean pass below, lit occasionally by moonlight reflecting off wavetops. Some dozed fitfully, others chain-smoked despite regulations. The navigators plotted courses, the engineers monitored temperamental engines. The pilots flew their aircraft with the practiced precision of men who understood that mechanical failure over the Pacific meant death as surely as enemy fire. Captain Sam Bakshas flew his B-29 at the head of his squadron, watching his instruments and thinking about the briefing. Every instinct developed through months of combat operations screamed that low-altitude attack violated survival principles. Yet he also understood that high-altitude missions had accomplished almost nothing. They had dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Japan with negligible results. Something had to change. Perhaps LeMay's madness was actually genius. Perhaps complete tactical reversal was the only logical response to systematic failure. The radio operators maintained silence. Japanese radar stations tracked American aircraft approaching their coast, but radio transmissions would only help them coordinate defenses. The bomber streams stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean, aircraft spaced at intervals, all converging on the same target coordinates. Around midnight, Chamorro Standard Time, the first B-29s crossed the Japanese coast. Pathfinder aircraft led the attack, specially designated bombers carrying marker bombs to illuminate the target for following waves. At 8 minutes past midnight on March 10, 1945, the Pathfinders arrived over Tokyo. The city sprawled beneath them, vast and dark, its blackout regulations enforced strictly. Only scattered lights marked streets and important buildings. Captain Thomas Power, commanding the Pathfinder element, checked his navigation carefully. The target area was northeastern Tokyo, the Shitamachi district, where working-class neighborhoods and small factories intermixed. The Pathfinders flew their designated patterns, approaching from opposite directions, and released their marker bombs. The markers ignited instantly, brilliant white phosphorus flames that burned with searing intensity. The Pathfinders had created an enormous fiery X across the target district, a blazing reference point visible for miles. Their job complete, the Pathfinder aircraft banked away from Tokyo and headed back toward the Marianas. Behind them, wave after wave of bombers approached the burning X. Air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo as the first incendiaries began to fall. The sound started as a whistle, growing louder as cluster bombs descended. At preset altitudes, the clusters broke apart. 38 bomblets per cluster scattered across wide areas, tumbling through the air. When they struck roofs, streets, or the ground, white phosphorus charges ignited jellied gasoline. Flames erupted instantly, adhesive fire that stuck to whatever it touched and could not be extinguished with water. The first incendiaries fell at 30 minutes past midnight. Within 15 minutes, hundreds of fires burned across the target district. The B-29 crews, approaching Tokyo from the south, could see the glow on the horizon while still 100 miles away. The fires were spreading faster than anyone had predicted. The closely packed wooden structures, the dry conditions, and the surface winds gusting at 45 to 67 miles per hour created perfect conditions for conflagration. Individual fires merged into larger blazes. Larger blazes coalesced into district-wide conflagrations. As the main bomber force arrived over the target area between midnight and 3 in the morning, they confronted a sight that defied comprehension. Tokyo was burning with an intensity that transformed night into day. The heat rising from below created violent updrafts that buffeted aircraft even at 5,000 feet. Some bombers were thrown hundreds of feet upward by thermal columns. Pilots fought their controls, struggling to maintain altitude and heading. The psychological impact on American crews was immediate and profound. They had expected heavy casualties from Japanese defenses. They had prepared themselves for fighter attacks and anti-aircraft fire. What they encountered instead was a firestorm of their own creation that shocked them more than any enemy opposition. Lieutenant Bill Lind, flying with the 497th Bombardment Group, described the scene with simple directness. The fires were so bright he could almost read a paper in his cockpit. The orange glow reflected off his polished aluminum fuselage, turning the silver bomber into a flying mirror of flame. Richard Bailey, flying in the rear elements of the bomber stream, approached Tokyo hours after the first Pathfinders. Even from 100 miles away, the fire dome was visible, a crimson semicircle dominating the horizon. As his aircraft drew closer, the extent of destruction became apparent. 16 square miles of Tokyo were burning simultaneously, creating a firestorm that generated its own weather system. The phenomenon that meteorologists would later classify as a firestorm occurred when thousands of individual fires created a self-sustaining thermal column. Superheated air rose rapidly from the burning district, pulling in fresh oxygen from surrounding areas at tremendous speed. These winds exceeded 60 miles per hour in some locations, strong enough to knock people off their feet and pull them into flames. The fire was feeding itself, growing more intense as it consumed fuel and generated winds that spread flames even faster. Japanese air defenses proved far less effective than American crews had feared. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but their guns had been calibrated for high-altitude targets. Shells burst above or below the bombers, rarely at the correct altitude. The gunners struggled to re-aim their weapons during the chaos of the attack, finding it nearly impossible to track targets accurately while fires consumed the city around their positions. Many gun positions were simply overwhelmed by spreading flames, forcing crews to abandon their weapons and flee for their lives. Japanese fighter opposition was almost non-existent. The night attack had caught fighter units unprepared. Without effective radar guidance systems or coordinated ground control, Japanese pilots had no way to locate American bombers in darkness. The few fighters that managed to take off flew blind, searching visually for targets that were essentially invisible against the night sky. No B-29s were shot down by Japanese fighters during Operation Meeting House. 0. The defenses that American planners had feared proved incapable of responding effectively to low-altitude night attack. The realization that swept through American bomber crews during those 3 hours over Tokyo was stunning. LeMay's tactics were working. The stripped-down bombers, flying low at night without most of their defensive guns, were not being slaughtered by Japanese defenses. Instead, they were operating with near impunity, dropping their incendiary loads with devastating effectiveness. The tactical revolution that had seemed suicidal during briefings was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. But success came with psychological cost. The bombardiers watching Tokyo burn through their bomb sites understood exactly what they were creating. Robert Bigelow, a B-29 pilot who later recounted the raid for the Virginia Aviation History Project, described releasing his bombs and banking sharply to escape the target area. His crew had created, in his words, an inferno beyond the wildest imaginings of Dante. Even as his aircraft flew more than 150 miles back toward the Pacific, his tail gunner reported that the glow from Tokyo's fires remained visible on the horizon. The smell penetrated bomber cabins despite pressurization. Crews reported a sickening mixture of burning wood, chemicals, and something else they refused to name but instinctively recognized. The stench of burning city, burning homes, burning people. The odor clung to aircraft and equipment long after crews returned to their bases. Ground crews who serviced the returning bombers could smell Tokyo on the fuselages. As the last B-29s released their incendiaries and turned for home around 3 in the morning, Tokyo was fully consumed by firestorm. The destruction exceeded anything in human experience up to that point in history. 15.8 square miles of the city had been reduced to ash and rubble, 267,000 buildings destroyed. The death toll would never be precisely known, but post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey estimated at least 80,000 killed, with some estimates exceeding 100,000. 100,000 people dead in a single night, more casualties than would be inflicted by the atomic bombing of Nagasaki 5 months later. The returning bomber crews began landing at their Mariana bases in mid-morning March 10th. The sun was bright, the coral runways hot, the tropical air humid and clean. The contrast with what they had witnessed hours earlier created cognitive dissonance that some crews would struggle with for the rest of their lives. Captain Bakshas taxied his B-29 to its parking position, shut down engines, and sat in silence for a long moment. Around him, other crews were emerging from their aircraft, some exuberant at survival, others subdued and pale. Lieutenant Bill Lind pulled back the window next to his pilot's seat and called down to his ground crew. "Hey boys, come over to this aircraft and smell Tokyo." The crew chief climbed up, took one breath, and recoiled. The entire fuselage reeked of smoke and death. Washing would not remove the smell entirely. It had soaked into fabrics and seeped into metal. Some aircraft would carry that scent for months. The loss figures told the story of tactical success. Of the 325 B-29s launched, 279 reached Tokyo and dropped their bombs. 12 aircraft were shot down. 42 were damaged, 2 so severely they had to be written off. 96 American airmen were killed or missing in action, 6 were wounded or injured. These casualties, while tragic, represented a loss rate below 4%, far lower than the catastrophic casualties predicted during briefings. LeMay's gamble had succeeded. The aircraft that ditched at sea told their own stories. 3 B-29s went down in the Pacific during the return flight. 5 damaged aircraft managed to ditch, and their crews were rescued by United States Navy submarines, positioned along the return route for exactly that purpose. The submarine rescue operations saved dozens of lives that would have been lost without such coordination. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Curtis LeMay received preliminary reports throughout the morning of March 10th. Reconnaissance photographs showed devastation exceeding his most optimistic predictions. The target area had been essentially erased from existence. Everything combustible had burned. Only concrete and brick structures remained standing, and even those were gutted by fire. The cottage industries that produced components for Japanese war production had been destroyed. The workers who staffed those industries were dead or homeless. The infrastructure that supported production had ceased to exist. General Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces, received word of the attack's success and immediately praised LeMay's results in communications to Washington. The destruction of Tokyo's industrial capacity would hamper Japanese war production significantly. The psychological impact on the Japanese population might hasten the war's conclusion. These military calculations, argued from the perspective of ending the conflict and saving Allied lives that would be lost in an invasion, provided justification for tactics that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier. LeMay himself understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished and the moral weight of those accomplishments. In later years, he would famously state that had the Allies lost the war, he would likely have been prosecuted as a war criminal for his role in area bombing campaigns. That acknowledgement revealed self-awareness about the human cost of his tactical decisions. 100,000 civilians dead in 3 hours. A city district erased, families destroyed, children killed. The calculations of total war justified these deaths as necessary to end the conflict more quickly. But justification did not erase the reality of what had been done. The success of Operation Meeting House validated LeMay's tactical revolution completely. Every principle he had violated, every conventional doctrine he had abandoned, had proven correct under actual combat conditions. Flying low had protected bombers from jet stream winds and reduced engine strain. Attacking at night had neutralized Japanese fighter defenses. Stripping guns had doubled bomb loads without increasing casualties. Individual attack profiles rather than formation flying had confused Japanese anti-aircraft batteries. The tactics that seemed backward had actually been correct all along. Within days, LeMay ordered similar incendiary attacks against other Japanese cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and others faced the same treatment. The B-29 crews, initially horrified by the low-altitude night missions, settled into grim routine. They flew mission after mission, watching Japanese cities transform into infernos below them, understanding that they were participants in one of history's most devastating bombing campaigns. The psychological burden on these airmen would emerge fully only after the war ended, as they struggled to reconcile their actions with their humanity. The March 10th raid established a template that would be repeated dozens of times over the following months. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, B-29s had dropped 104,000 tons of bombs on Japan, reducing 169 square miles in 66 cities to rubble. The bombing missions left 9.2 million civilians homeless, including 3.1 million in Tokyo alone. Official estimates from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, considered conservative, put Japanese casualties at 330,000 killed and 476,000 injured from the entire strategic bombing campaign. The tactical irony was profound. For years, American military doctrine had emphasized high-altitude precision bombing as the only acceptable strategic approach. The B-29 had been designed specifically for that mission. Billions of dollars and the efforts of thousands of engineers had created an aircraft optimized for operations above 30,000 feet. And then Curtis LeMay had achieved unprecedented success by doing the exact opposite, throwing out every design assumption and operating principle the aircraft had been built around. The backwards tactics succeeded because they adapted to reality rather than clinging to doctrine. Japanese cities were vulnerable to fire, so LeMay used fire. Japanese defenses were weak at night, so LeMay attacked at night. High altitude caused mechanical problems, so LeMay flew low. Defensive guns added weight without providing protection against the actual threats, so LeMay removed them. Each decision violated established principles. Each decision proved correct under combat conditions. The B-29 crews came to understand this irony through direct experience. The missions they had considered suicidal proved safer than conventional high-altitude attacks. The tactics they had opposed became routine. The general they had considered mad demonstrated genius. The psychological adjustment from terror to confidence happened rapidly as crews realized that LeMay's analysis had been accurate and their fears had been wrong. But confidence did not erase moral complexity. The men who flew these missions understood exactly what they were doing. They were burning cities. They were killing civilians by the tens of thousands. The military justifications, the strategic necessities, the calculations about ending the war more quickly, all of these provided intellectual framework for their actions. But intellectual framework did not eliminate the sensory reality of watching cities burn, smelling the smoke of destruction, and knowing that their bombs had killed people who had never held weapons or worn uniforms. Some crewmen would later describe feeling pride in their effectiveness and horror at their effects simultaneously. They had executed their missions perfectly, achieving tactical success that would be studied in military academies for generations. They had also participated in some of the most destructive attacks in human history. Both statements were true. Both had to be held in mind together. The tension between military accomplishment and moral unease would define how many crew members remembered and processed their wartime service. The tactical lessons from Operation Meeting House extended far beyond World War II. The demonstration that mass bomber formations could destroy entire cities influenced Cold War strategic thinking. The concept of strategic bombing aimed at civilian populations and infrastructure rather than solely military targets became central to nuclear deterrence theory. The firebombing campaigns thus cast long shadows into the atomic age, shaping how nations thought about warfare and its potential consequences for decades. For Curtis LeMay personally, Operation Meeting House represented vindication of his tactical judgment and analytical approach to warfare problems. He had identified systematic failures in American bombing operations. He had analyzed the causes of those failures without bias or preconception. He had developed solutions that contradicted established doctrine but addressed actual operational realities, and he had possessed the moral courage to implement those solutions despite intense opposition and personal risk to his career. LeMay would go on to command Strategic Air Command during the early Cold War, building it into the primary instrument of American nuclear deterrence. His approach remained consistent: cold-eyed analysis of technical problems, willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and absolute focus on effectiveness, regardless of whether methods seemed acceptable by traditional standards. The same qualities that made him effective made him controversial. His advocacy for aggressive military solutions, including support for preemptive nuclear strikes during the Cuban Missile Crisis, would cement his reputation as both brilliant tactician and dangerous extremist. The immediate aftermath of Operation Meeting House saw LeMay continuing his firebombing campaign with methodical intensity. Nagoya was attacked on March 11th and again on March 12th. Osaka burned on March 13th. Kobe followed on March 16th. The pattern repeated across Japan's urban centers. Each attack followed the template established over Tokyo: low altitude, night operations, incendiaries, individual attack profiles. Each attack produced similar results: massive destruction, high casualties, minimal American losses. The Japanese military command understood that they faced technological and tactical superiority they could not counter. If American bombers could strike with such devastating effect, no city remained safe. Defense against mass formations of B-29s proved nearly impossible. Japanese fighter aircraft could not fly effectively at night in sufficient numbers to disrupt the raids. Anti-aircraft fire, while sometimes effective, could not prevent determined attackers from reaching their targets. Some Japanese leaders began privately acknowledging what they could not say publicly. The war was lost. Yet honor, duty, and the military culture that still dominated Japanese decision-making prevented open discussion of surrender. Japan would fight on, and more cities would burn, until either invasion or some other catastrophe forced an end to the conflict. The firebombing campaign demonstrated American capability to destroy Japanese cities at will, but did not by itself compel surrender. That would require atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war in August 1945. The 300 B-29 crews who attacked Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, had participated in history's most destructive single air raid. They had validated tactical approaches that seemed suicidal through briefings, but proved devastatingly effective in execution. They had demonstrated that sometimes the only path forward required abandoning every established principle and doing everything backwards. And they had created destruction so vast that it would be exceeded in human history only by the atomic bombs dropped 5 months later on cities that had been specifically spared from firebombing to preserve them as atomic targets. The burns that covered Tokyo that night told a story about warfare, technology, and human decision-making that remains relevant nearly 8 decades later. Sometimes genius appears indistinguishable from madness until results prove otherwise. Sometimes the most effective tactics violate every principle taught in training. Sometimes success requires accepting risks that seem unacceptable. And sometimes the greatest destruction comes not from advanced technology used as intended, but from relatively simple technology employed in ways its designers never imagined. The smoke from Tokyo's ruins drifted across the Pacific for days after March 10th, a dark column visible from reconnaissance aircraft flying at high altitude. The ash settled on the islands of the Marianas, carried by upper atmosphere winds, a physical reminder of what had been accomplished. Ground crews cleaning B-29s found residue coating fuselages, a greasy mixture that required repeated washing. Some aircraft never completely lost the smell. The Japanese government struggled to comprehend the scale of catastrophe. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso received conflicting reports. Throughout March 10th and 11th, initial estimates of casualties ranged wildly, from 30,000 to over 100,000 dead. The number of homeless varied from 500,000 to over 1 million. The ministries tasked with emergency response found their own offices destroyed or cut off from communication. The administrative machinery needed to coordinate relief efforts had been consumed in the same fires that killed the people who needed help. Emperor Hirohito made a rare public appearance on March 11th, touring damaged areas in northeastern Tokyo. His motorcade drove through neighborhoods where nothing remained but ash and scattered rubble. The emperor, who had spent his life in ceremonial isolation, witnessed firsthand the cost of the war he had sanctioned but never truly understood. Survivors bowed as his car passed, ingrained respect, overcoming grief and shock. According to witnesses who accompanied him, the emperor returned to the palace in silence, and tears had tracked through the ash on his face. The survivors faced challenges that would persist for months and years. Over 1 million people had lost their homes in a single night. They crowded into schools, temples, public buildings, and parks throughout western Tokyo and surrounding suburbs. Food distribution systems had broken down completely. Water supplies were contaminated by ash and debris. Disease threatened to kill thousands more. The Tokyo metropolitan government, already strained by years of war, struggled to provide even basic necessities to a displaced population that exceeded the entire population of many cities. Temporary housing sprouted across undamaged areas of Tokyo. Crude shelters constructed from salvaged materials, canvas tents provided by relief agencies, simple wooden structures that recreated in miniature form the neighborhoods the firestorm had erased. Markets reopened within days, selling salvaged goods and limited food supplies brought from rural areas. Life reasserted itself with stubborn resilience, even in the shadow of total destruction. The psychological trauma ran deeper than physical destruction. Survivors described a sense of unreality that persisted for weeks and months. They had witnessed hell manifest on Earth. They had watched their world burn. The normal frameworks through which humans process experience proved inadequate for integrating memories of that magnitude. Some survivors simply stopped speaking about that night, locking the memories away where they could not be consciously accessed. Others became obsessive chroniclers, documenting every detail they could remember, as if recording the horror might make it more comprehensible. Katsumoto Saotome, who survived the March 10th firebombing as a young man, would spend decades collecting testimonies from other survivors. In 1998, he helped establish the Center of the Tokyo Raids and War Damage in Koto Ward. The library and museum housed documents, literature, and survivor accounts, preserving memory for generations who would have no direct connection to the events. Saotome understood that as survivors aged and died, the responsibility for maintaining historical memory would fall to those who had not experienced the firestorm but had inherited its legacy. The international community struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction when news eventually filtered through wartime censorship. Neutral countries received limited information about the Tokyo raid. Detailed casualty figures and damage assessments would not become public until after Japan's surrender allowed American survey teams to conduct thorough investigations. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey would spend months interviewing survivors, examining damage patterns, and calculating economic impact. Their reports, completed in 1946, provided detailed assessment of what had occurred. 267,000 buildings destroyed. 16 square miles of urban area eliminated, over 1 million people rendered homeless. The casualty count, while never precisely determined, likely exceeded 80,000 dead with an additional 40,000 injured. These numbers, compiled with bureaucratic precision, attempted to quantify the unquantifiable. Behind each statistic lay human stories, families destroyed, lives altered, trauma that would echo through generations. The debate over the Tokyo raid's necessity and morality began even before the war ended and has continued through subsequent decades. Military historians argue that area bombing shortened the war by destroying Japanese industrial capacity and undermining civilian morale, potentially saving lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. The calculation held that killing 100,000 civilians in one night might prevent the deaths of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers during invasion and continued conventional warfare. Critics contend that the deliberate targeting of civilian populations violated just war principles, regardless of strategic justification. The creation of firestorms designed to kill indiscriminately crossed moral lines that should not be crossed even during total war. The debate remains unresolved after nearly 8 decades, complicated by the fog of war, the passage of time, and the impossibility of knowing what alternative history might have unfolded had different decisions been made. Curtis LeMay himself never expressed public regret for the firebombing campaign, but he acknowledged the moral complexity in remarkably candid terms. His statement that the Allies' defeat would have resulted in his prosecution as a war criminal revealed clear-eyed understanding that his actions existed in moral grey areas, where military necessity and ethical constraints came into tension. That acknowledgement distinguished LeMay from commanders who simply claimed righteousness or denied responsibility entirely. The tactical legacy of Operation Meeting House extended far beyond its immediate military impact. LeMay had demonstrated that established doctrine could be completely wrong under specific circumstances. That altitude, formation flying, defensive armament, and other principles taught as fundamental could actually be counterproductive. The lesson that tactics must adapt to operational realities rather than conforming to theoretical models would influence military thinking for generations. The B-29 superfortress itself gained legendary status after the firebombing campaign validated its capabilities when used in ways its designers had never anticipated. The aircraft that had been struggling to achieve results through high-altitude precision bombing became devastatingly effective through low-altitude area attacks. This tactical flexibility, the ability to adapt a weapon system to missions beyond its original design parameters, became a sought-after characteristic in subsequent military aircraft development. The broader strategic implications shaped Cold War planning in fundamental ways. The demonstration that conventional bombing could destroy cities influenced early nuclear deterrence theory. If 300 bombers with incendiaries could eliminate 16 square miles of Tokyo, what could a single bomber with an atomic weapon accomplish? The answer came 5 months later over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the conceptual groundwork had been laid over Tokyo in March. The physical evidence of the raid largely vanished in Tokyo's post-war reconstruction. The burned districts were rebuilt over subsequent years and decades, with priority given to infrastructure and housing. Wide streets replaced narrow alleys. Modern buildings rose where wooden houses had stood. The city that emerged from the ashes bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before March 9, 1945. This erasure of the physical past complicated memory. Survivors found themselves unable to show their children where they had lived, where schools and temples had stood, where the firestorm had raged. Memorial services for Tokyo raid victims began in the immediate post-war period and have continued annually ever since. Each March 9th, survivors and descendants gather at the Tokyo Memorial Hall in Sumida Ward to honor the dead and preserve memory. These ceremonies serve multiple purposes. They provide space for grief that has never fully healed. They educate younger generations about events that shaped their nation's history. And they assert the importance of remembering even the most painful chapters of the past. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government erected the Tokyo Memorial Hall and Museum in 1970, dedicated to victims of both the March 9th firebombing and the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. The museum houses artifacts salvaged from ruins, melted glass, twisted metal, charred possessions. It displays testimony from survivors. It serves as both memorial and educational institution, attracting thousands of visitors annually, including many students who come to learn about their city's history. As the years passed and survivors aged, the urgency of preserving first-hand testimony increased. Organizations formed to collect and archive survivor accounts before death silenced the witnesses. These projects created extensive oral history collections, recorded interviews, and written memoirs that documented the raid from perspectives of those who experienced it. The testimony revealed patterns, the speed with which fires spread, the hurricane-force winds, the impossible choices between dangers, the randomness of survival. Curtis LeMay retired from the United States Air Force in 1965 as a 4-star general. His career after World War II included service as Strategic Air Command Chief, where he built SAC into the primary instrument of American nuclear deterrence, and Air Force Vice Chief of Staff. He received numerous decorations and honors, though his role in the firebombing campaign remained controversial throughout his life and after his death in 1990. The B-29 crews who flew Operation Meeting House scattered after the war ended. Most returned to civilian life, carrying memories they rarely discussed even with family members. The psychological burden of having participated in history's most destructive conventional bombing raid manifested differently across individuals. Some felt pride in military accomplishment, others struggled with guilt and moral doubt. Many experienced both emotions simultaneously, unable to fully reconcile the contradiction. Veterans organizations eventually provided spaces where former B-29 crewmen could discuss their experiences with others who understood. These gatherings allowed men who had maintained decades of silence to finally speak about what they had witnessed and done. The conversations revealed common themes: the shock of seeing Tokyo burn so completely, the smell that penetrated their aircraft, the realization that their bombs were killing civilians, the relief at survival mixed with horror at effectiveness. The question of whether the firebombing campaign was necessary to end the war remains debated among historians. Some argue that Japan was already on the verge of collapse by March 1945, with its navy destroyed, its air force depleted, and its supply lines severed. Under this interpretation, the firebombing was militarily unnecessary and served only to inflict additional suffering on a population already defeated. Others contend that Japanese military leadership remained committed to fighting to the end, regardless of material circumstances, and that only overwhelming destruction combined with atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war finally forced surrender. The technological legacy extended to post-war aviation development. The lessons learned from B-29 operations influenced design of subsequent bomber aircraft. The importance of engine reliability, the need for tactical flexibility, the value of defensive systems that could be adapted or removed based on mission requirements, all became standard considerations in aircraft development. The B-29's successor, the B-50 Superfortress, incorporated improvements based directly on operational experience over Japan. For the families of victims, the raid's legacy manifested in absence and loss that persisted through generations. Children who lost parents in the firestorm grew up with voids that could not be filled. Siblings separated during the chaos, sometimes never reunited. Entire family lines ended in the flames. The demographic impact extended beyond immediate casualties to affect marriage patterns, birth rates, and population distribution across Tokyo and surrounding areas for years afterward. 79 years after March 9, 1945, the Tokyo firebombing remains among the deadliest air raids in human history. Its casualty count exceeded that of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and approached the toll of Hiroshima. Yet it occupies a less prominent place in global memory than those nuclear attacks. Perhaps conventional weapons lack the apocalyptic symbolism of atomic warfare, or perhaps one massive tragedy tends to overshadow another when they occur in the same conflict. The relative obscurity of Operation Meeting House compared to Hiroshima and Nagasaki reflects broader patterns in how societies remember and forget wartime destruction. The story that began in a Guam briefing room on March 8, 1945, with shocked crews learning they would fly suicide missions, ended with validation of tactics that seemed insane. Curtis LeMay's decision to do everything backwards, to strip guns, fly low, attack at night, abandon formations, proved correct on every count. The conventional wisdom that had governed strategic bombing for decades was wrong under the specific circumstances of the campaign against Japan. Success required not incremental adjustment but complete reversal. The broader lesson transcends military history. Sometimes the only path forward requires abandoning established principles entirely. Sometimes what appears suicidal proves safer than accepted methods. Sometimes genius looks like madness until results demonstrate otherwise, and sometimes the most effective approach violates every rule taught by tradition and doctrine. But effectiveness does not equal righteousness. The tactical brilliance that made Operation Meeting House devastatingly successful does not resolve the moral questions it raised. 100,000 civilians dead in 3 hours, a city district erased, the deliberate creation of conditions designed to kill indiscriminately. These actions can be analyzed as military necessity, as strategic calculation, as unfortunate requirements of total war. But analysis does not erase the human reality of what occurred. The B-29 crews who flew that night, the Japanese civilians who died in the flames, the survivors who carried trauma for decades, the families that inherited loss across generations, all of them became part of a story about warfare, technology, and human decisions that continues to resonate. The story asks uncomfortable questions about the limits of acceptable military action, about the relationship between strategic necessity and moral constraint, about how victory is achieved and at what cost. In the end, Operation Meeting House demonstrated that Curtis LeMay understood strategic bombing better than the theorists who had designed the doctrine. His willingness to challenge every assumption, to risk his career on unproven tactics, to accept moral burden for devastating attacks, achieved results that conventional approaches could not. The firebombing campaign shortened the war. It saved Allied lives that would have been lost in an invasion. It killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in the process. Whether that exchange represents justified military strategy or war crime depends on perspective, values, and judgment about the ethics of total war. The debate will continue as long as people study military history and grapple with questions about what nations may do to their enemies during existential conflict. The only certainty is that March 9th to 10th, 1945, stands as one of the pivotal moments in the history of strategic bombing, when tactics that seemed backward proved forward-thinking, and when the deadliest night of conventional bombing in human history unfolded over Tokyo. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.